Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. Michael Noland here, and tonight we're going to take a look at the Beatles' very first album. That, of course, is the album called The Beatles, Please Please Me, with Love Me Do and 12 other songs. Okay, so I agree, not their most artistically entitled album, but more on that in just a moment. Okay, so first of all, a quick shout out to all our new subscribers and of course to all of our viewers. The channel is approaching 20,000 views, if you can believe that, and that's been great. And I've really enjoyed putting together these videos for you guys. But you may have noticed in the last couple of weeks that my output hasn't quite been up to what it has been in the past. Trust me, this is not due to lack of energy. You see, I'm on the injured list these days, and quite literally I am a bit handicapped when it comes to actually setting up my studio. The entire setup is completely modular, and when I'm at 100%, it only takes me a mere matter of minutes to set it up. But these days, with me on a waiting list for a surgical procedure, the whole process takes a little bit more time. So please bear with me over the next few weeks here, and I'll do my best to keep the video output at a maximum, while of course maintaining quality and value for you, the viewer. So that'll give you an explanation as to why in this video and in the last video, I'm sitting in a chair rather than my usual stool. In order for me to shoot, everything has had to come down in the studio. And to tell you the truth, I'm not sure that I don't like the look. Either way, it's my pledge to you to put out the best quality videos that I'm capable of. And of course, I always make an effort to make sure each and every video offers something that the last one doesn't. I want to thank all of you viewers for the sharing that you've done with our videos, and we're so close in gathering in our second group of 100 subscribers. At 184 subscribers, we're 16 away from 200. Now I know it's been a while since we talked about our Phase 4 goals. Just a quick reminder that we chose to take on a bit of a bigger bite in our Phase 4 goals than we did in our Phase 3 goals. If you remember, our Phase 3 goal was to obtain our first 100 subscribers. We've done that and 84 more at this point. Our Phase 4 goals, though, are to get our first 500 subscribers. 200 would have been too easy, and we knew that this phase would take a bit more time to accomplish than Phase 3. But just like my endeavors to put out quality videos, I also don't want to stand still, and I want all of the challenges that we choose here at the channel to be reachable, but not necessarily easy. So a big shout out to all of our new subscribers, and a big shout out to all the sharing that our viewers have done. But now let's get into a more in-depth discussion of the Beatles' very first album, The Beatles, Please Please Me, with Love Me Do and 12 other songs. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about tonight in regard to the Beatles' first album is that of their junior status still at this point. You have to remember, at the time of the February 11th of 1963 recordings for the album, 4 of the 14 tracks were already in the can. These were the 2 tracks from their first 2 singles. Of course, their first single, Love Me Do, only charted to number 17 in England at this time. A huge move forward, though, for the band. And even the song Please Please Me, with a much improved Beatles sound, only charts at this time to number 2. So for EMI to even consider offering a long player, in other words, an LP, to the Beatles, who were at this point anywhere from 20 to 22 years old, wasn't so much an act of faith by EMI as it was, let's go ahead and cash in on this group before the bottom drops out. But with Brian Epstein having a firm understanding with their brand new producer, George Martin, and his assistant, Norman Smith, it was the intention by George Martin at this point to reproduce in the studio, the Beatles' live act. There was even some discussion of recording the album live at the Cavern. But after George Martin looking into the recording conditions that existed at the Cavern, he decided wisely at this point to go ahead and bring them in to EMI. It's here on this album that the Beatles establish a temporary rule of sorts. You see, it's with this album and their following album where they agree to write 8 of the songs with 6 covers. The songs on this album that aren't written by the Beatles are a fair representation of the type of material that the Beatles had learned to cover, not only in Germany, but locally there at the Cavern, as well as them achieving a bit more sophisticated sound as they did the theater circuit there in England. Now, before we get too much further into the album, there's one point I'd like to bring out. Take a listen to Paul McCartney's bass playing on this album. Now granted, the low end isn't as present even on the new mixes. This was their first album, and they would continue to be frustrated with the lack of bass response in Paul's bass guitar. But his playing on this album, with very few exceptions, heralds the bass player that he would eventually become. Really, at this point in time, you've got to remember, most artists weren't necessarily musicians. Many of them merely supplied the vocals to songs they never even wrote themselves. Most artists would come in and do the vocals on songs that their management would give to them, and very few of them were actually accomplished musicians on top of that. But I will compare Paul McCartney's bass playing with that to any top 10 song in 1963 in the United States. Now, the reason I make this statement is I actually listened to top 10 songs recorded in 1963. And with the exception of American bass sounding much more rich, much deeper, the actual bass playing on this album sounds like it's coming from a studio musician who had been there several years, maybe 26, 27 years old, not 21. Like Paul McCartney. And it's on this album that him and Ringo really develop a sound. Paul getting intricate when Ringo allows it. Ringo filling in hi-hat rolls when Paul steps back and allows that to come to the fore. Almost all of the Beatles' actual performances on this album shine. But it's at this point that I hear a world-class bass player. And at that time in England, only the Shadows were as good a musicians as the Beatles were. And you can tell by listening to these tracks, Paul's been listening to their bass player as well. Now, if you recall in my review of Peter Jackson's Get Back, I brought out that it was Paul McCartney's intention with the Get Back project to get the Beatles back into performing shape. And the album cover that they originally chose for the album, when it was still to be issued as Get Back, was based on the photograph of the Beatles' Please Please Me album. And what I find interesting here is that during those Get Back sessions, during the Let It Be sessions, we see the Beatles scrambling for days and weeks trying to get back into a performing shape. And the very fact that they chose to mimic their very first cover tells you that it was the Beatles' intention to get back into a certain performing shape. Whereas with Get Back, they spent weeks getting into that shape. But with Please Please Me, they spent hours. No, I'm serious. They spent actually whole groups of hours recording this album. Sgt. Pepper sessions, almost 6 months. Please Please Me, less than 13 hours at about 12 hours and 45 minutes. Now, it's true at this point the Beatles did have 4 of the 14 tracks already in the can at this point. But the Herculean task of recording 10 songs in a single day, where engineers need a single day just to turn on the equipment in studios these days, the Beatles surprised even George Martin at this point. He made the comment that he just couldn't believe it. They were like a machine. The more that he threw at them, the more they could accomplish. So just like Neo being fed kung fu programming, George Martin threw at the Beatles everything he could think of during this less than 13-hour period. Starting at 10 o'clock in the morning, ending at 10:45 p.m., the Beatles finally managed to record an entire album in a single day. Now, when you think about this, you have to remember John Lennon was ill at this time. He was in the middle of an extremely bad cold. He had been supplying lead and backing vocals all day, and it's at this point that they have one song left to do, and that, of course, is the powerful Twist and Shout. George Martin knew this song taxed John's voice even under the best conditions. Paul notes that John had been sucking on Zoobs all day to coat his throat so that he could attack each and every vocal, whether it was lead or backing. Quite literally, in the last minutes of the last hour of recording this album, John Lennon made 2 attempts at recording the lead vocal of this song. Amazingly, it's his very first attempt that he nails, and it's that very first attempt that is on the album that we know today. This is not only a rarity in recording, but it certainly is a rarity with newbies in the studio. But you see, this is what I want to bring out about the Beatles. The Beatles to EMI must have been just a bunch of newbies. EMI didn't have a lot of faith in the band. They didn't know that they had one of the most professional groups they could ever have imagined to have signed. These young men grew from a group of boys in a skiffle group over a period of years, achieving a new level, one rung at a time. And as far as I'm concerned, they continued this upward mobility all throughout their career. Now you have to understand, this is a full year before America would even get a hint that the Beatles existed. But in England, Beatlemania was already the rage. And it took EMI by storm when this album became #1 and stayed on the charts for an amazing 30 weeks. This kind of staying power had a lot to do with getting certain American entities interested in the Beatles. Now, it wasn't uncommon for long play LPs to be quite good sellers for more established acts. Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra being only 2 who not only experimented with the LP, the long player, but even made some artistic choices and were creating sounds for each LP that they were putting out. But for a pop group, especially with the eldest being only 22 years old, given an LP in England at this time is not only a clear indication that George Martin knew what he had, that Brian Epstein knew what he had, and that if EMI as an entity were slightly confused by the Beatles, they as a team would let EMI know that these young men were here to stay. Even in these first recordings, there are some overdubs. The entire album was recorded on a 2-track machine. But even at this early stage, the Beatles had learned how to do some overdubbing. Here they would overdub keyboards with George Martin, establishing himself as a backup keyboard for the Beatles whenever they needed him and his style of playing. And of course, they were thrilled with the idea of being able to overdub hand claps. On their next album, they would go overdub crazy, and we'll talk about that in the future. But here we can see that the Beatles, right off, were taking advantage of studio trickery. But soon the world would come to expect the Beatles to do this with almost anything they touched. Need a new #1 hit? No problem. We'll knock a couple off for you in the next week or 2. Need 7 songs for a movie? No problem. We'll write that up on the weekend. Time for a new album? Guess John and I gotta get to work. The fact that the Beatles made a career of making everything look easy doesn't take away in the slightest the fact that these 4 young men were geniuses. The fact that this album sold so well at a time that it was thought teenagers wouldn't pay this kind of price for the products. And the absolute fact that they wound up not only doing so, but doing so pretty much in mass. As far as weeks on the chart, this is the Beatles' biggest selling album. They would sell more album units later on, but in 1963 England, 30 weeks at number 1 was an amazing feat. So that about covers the video tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to continue on with the series in the future. I also have a series of tutorials that will be based on not only Beastcam, but Beastcam and putting video together in LumaFusion. It's my intention with these upcoming tutorials to give you a bird's eye view of LumaFusion, a good camera app, because they do seem to be working very well together. And I want to share the whole process with you because it is a bit different because of the app itself. And I've been really happy with the sound in the last couple of videos, and we're going to continue to adjust and improve all of that in the future. And again, please bear with me as I'm a bit on the injured list these days, but as I promised, I will attempt to keep my output at a maximum. And of course, I've always at least got a dozen videos that I want to film next. An upcoming series will be on ShiftScreen 4X and how to utilize that in connection with the Apple side of things. And so I want to do a couple of tutorials to put together my video ideas as well as the entire video itself. So a big thank you for watching the video. We hope you got something out of it. If so, please give us a thumbs up. And of course, please consider subscribing to the tribe. Hit that top bell notification and you'll be notified of all future videos. This is The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland, and we'll see you down the road.